You have the right to remain silent, I said. He just stared at me like I'd spoken in another language, like the sentence didn't compute. Like a man who had spent 2 years rehearsing a role, and suddenly the stage had been pulled out from under him. My name is Alan Kowalski. I'm 61 years old. I live in Kitchener, Ontario, and I have spent the better part of 4 decades doing the kind of work that doesn't make you rich, but makes you honest. 31 years at a sheet metal fabrication plant, foreman for the last 12. I know how things fit together. I know when something's been cut wrong. I know when the measurements are off by just enough to cause a collapse later. That instinct has served me well in a lot of ways. The most important was the day I looked at my son-in-law across the dinner table and realized he was measuring everything in my house, not with his eyes, with something colder than that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up. My wife Elaine passed 4 years ago. Stroke. She was 57. It was a Wednesday morning in February, the kind of gray, flat day that Southern Ontario does better than anywhere on earth, and she was pouring her second cup of coffee when it happened. The paramedics were there in 9 minutes. It wasn't enough. She was gone before I got to the hospital. Elaine had this quality, I don't know exactly what to call it. She could read a room the way some people read a page, instantly, without effort, without having to think about it. She'd meet someone once and come home and say, that person is going to cause problems for somebody. She was almost never wrong. She'd looked at me across a church basement 34 years ago and apparently decided I was worth the risk. I still don't know what she saw, but she was right about most things, so I've chosen to believe she was right about that too. Before she left us, in that brief terrible window when she was conscious and we both knew what's still happening, she held my hand very tightly and said, Alan, watch out for Meg. She sees the best in people, like I did. But you and I both know that's not always a safe thing, I said. I know. She said, I mean it. I said, I know, Elaine. I know. I kept that promise for 3 years without incident, and then Meg brought home a man named Trevor Ashworth. Meg is my daughter. She was 29 when she met Trevor, working as a project coordinator for a construction management firm in Waterloo. She's sharp, organized, the kind of person who has a system for everything and gets quietly frustrated when other people don't. She got that from Elaine. She got her smile from Elaine too. This wide, unself-conscious thing that takes over her whole face when she's genuinely happy. I hadn't seen it much in the years after her mother died. When Trevor came along, I saw it again. That was the first reason I didn't say anything. Trevor Ashworth was 33, originally from somewhere in Alberta, vague about the specifics. He called himself a property investment consultant, which I later learned is a title that costs nothing to print on a business card and requires no licensing, no credentials, and no actual track record to claim. He drove a late-model Audi. He wore clothes that were expensive in a quiet, understated way, the kind of expense that's designed to not look expensive until you know what to look for. He had very good teeth and a handshake that went on a beat too long. The first time Meg brought him to my house in Kitchener for dinner, he walked in, shook my hand, looked around the front room and said, "Beautiful place. What's the square footage? Not nice to meet you. Not Meg's told me so much about you." The first thing out of his mouth was a question about the dimensions of my house. I said, around 1,800. He nodded slowly, like he was filing the number away. Then he said, detached, right? Original lot size? And I thought, what kind of man meets his girlfriend's father for the first time and asks about lot size? I made dinner. I was polite. I watched him the way I'd learned to watch people on a shop floor, the way you watch someone handling equipment they haven't been properly trained on, looking for the mistakes they don't know they're making yet. He barely asked Meg a question all evening. He asked me 4 questions about the house and 2 about the neighborhood. He told a story about a property deal in Calgary that had made him, and I'm quoting here, a very tidy return. He used that phrase, very tidy return, twice, with the same small smile both times, like he was letting me in on something. I smiled back. I made coffee. I waited until he left. Then I sat in my kitchen for an hour just thinking. The next morning I called my oldest friend, a man named Barry, who had spent 30 years in title insurance and had seen more property fraud than most RCMP investigators. I said, Barry, hypothetically, How would a person go about trying to take a house from an elderly parent of someone they were with? Barry said, "How long do you have?" I said, "As long as it takes." He gave me 2.5 hours on the phone and a list of methods organized by frequency. It was not a comforting list. I wrote everything down. I want to be clear about something. At that point, I had no proof. I had a bad feeling, and a man who'd asked too many questions about square footage. That's not evidence of anything except poor social skills. But I'd worked with enough people to know that instincts aren't random. They're pattern recognition. Your brain sees something and knows before you do. So I started paying quiet attention. Trevor and Meg dated for 14 months. In that time, I never once saw him be unkind to her, which I'll give him. He was attentive in public, generous with compliments. The kind of partner that makes a woman's friends say, "He's so wonderful, you're so lucky." He proposed on Meg's birthday in October at a restaurant in Uptown Waterloo. She called me from the parking lot immediately afterward, voice shaking. And I said all the right things because she was happy. And it was real, and I was not going to be the reason she didn't get to have this. The day after the engagement, I called Barry again. I said, "Walk me through that trust structure one more time." He said, "Alan, that's a serious step." I said, "I know." He said, "Once you set it up properly, it's not easy to undo." I said, "I'm not planning on undoing it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There's a solicitor I know in Guelph. Her name is Fiona. She's thorough and she doesn't mess around. Do you want her number?" I said yes. 2 weeks later, I sat across from Fiona Cheng in her office on Wyndham Street North. She was precise and efficient and had no patience for vagueness, which I respected immediately. She explained the structure clearly. The house would go into an irrevocable family trust. I would remain the sole trustee and beneficiary during my lifetime. Any transfer, sale, or encumbrance would require my explicit written consent, witnessed and notarized, with a mandatory cooling-off period of 72 hours. Any transaction that bypassed this process would be legally void, not challengeable, not disputable. Void, as in it would not exist. She slid the documents across the desk and said, "This is about as airtight as it gets in Ontario property law. No one takes this house without going through a process you control at every step." I signed. I didn't tell Meg. I didn't tell Barry. I told Fiona and I told no one else. I went home, put the trust documents in a metal lockbox in the back of my bedroom closet behind 30 years of tax records, and went back to watching. The wedding was in July, a Saturday afternoon at a venue outside Cambridge, one of those converted heritage properties with exposed brick and gardens that cost more per hour than I used to make in a week. 93 guests. Meg wore a bracelet that had been Elaine's. I had to look away when I saw it. I walked her down the aisle and thought about Elaine for every single step of it, about how she would have been completely undone by this moment, about how she would have cried loudly and happily and not been even slightly embarrassed, and Meg would have been mortified and loved her for it. I thought about the things she'd said to me in the hospital. She sees the best in people. Trevor stood at the front in his suit and his expression of confident ease, and I watched his eyes the way I always watched his eyes. During the vows, while Meg looked at him, his gaze drifted. To the room, to the guests, to his phone in his jacket pocket, which I saw him check twice. Once would have been an accident. Twice was information. I gave the toast. I danced with my daughter. I shook Trevor's hand and called him son, and it cost me something I haven't entirely gotten back. Then I drove home to Kitchener, sat in my kitchen, and called Barry. I said, "They're married." He said, "I know." I said, "Keep your eyes open." He said, "Alan." They've been open. Barry had a contact at the land registry office in Waterloo region. A woman named, well, I'll call her a longtime colleague, because she asked me not to use her name. She had 17 years in the office, and she knew every variety of documentation irregularity that had passed through that building. I'd asked Barry to ask her, quietly, to flag anything with my name or address that came through. The call came 11 days after the wedding. It was a Thursday morning. I was eating toast. She said, "Alan, there's a transfer of title document that came through yesterday. Your name is listed as transferor. The property at your address is being transferred to Trevor Ashworth as sole grantee." I put down my toast. I said, "I did not sign any transfer of title," she said. "I didn't think you had." The notarial stamp is from someone I've seen before. He had his commission suspended by the Law Society of Ontario 8 months ago. He's been doing side work for cash. I said, I need a certified copy of that document. She said, I'm printing it now. I drove to her office, picked up the copy, went directly to Fiona's. She looked at it for less than a minute. Then she put it down very carefully, the way you put down something fragile that you don't want to disturb. She said, this is a forged instrument. The trust structure makes the transfer void regardless. But the forged signature and the suspended notary make this a criminal matter. You need to go to the Ontario Provincial Police. I said, not yet. She looked at me. I said, I want him to play this out completely. I want him to show up at my door believing he's already won. Because when I walk into a police station, I want to walk in with something that closes itself. Fiona studied me for a long moment. Then she said, you're going to let him think it worked. I said, for a little while. She said, don't wait too long. I said, I won't. I went home and started building the file. Barry helped me trace Trevor's business entities. He had 3 numbered companies registered in Alberta and 1 in Ontario. 2 of the Alberta ones had no assets on record, no business activity, no verifiable address. The Ontario one had been incorporated 11 months before he met Meg, which I found interesting. It had been used in one previous real estate transaction in Brantford, Ontario, 2 years earlier, where a 74-year-old widower had nearly lost his home through a fraudulent title transfer before his son hired a real estate lawyer who caught the documents in time. Barry found the family. The son found me. His name was Gord, and he was extremely angry and extremely organized about it. He had documentation of the entire scheme, forged quitclaim instrument, suspended notary, same numbered company, same pattern, different house, same Trevor Ashworth. I added everything to the file. Fiona's office found the notary. They dug through Law Society records and connected him to a sworn statement in a separate proceeding where someone had confirmed handing Trevor cash in exchange for notarized fraudulent documents. That statement went into the file too. Then, in September, Trevor made the mistake I'd been waiting for. He listed the house. No MLS, no public listing, private sale, off-market. My house, listed at $890,000. There was a purchase agreement already in place with a numbered company as the buyer. The deal was set to close in 40 days. Barry's contact called me the afternoon she saw it filed. She said, Alan, there's a purchase agreement on record. Cash buyer, 40 days to close. I said, thank you. She said, Alan. I said, I'm moving. I called Barry. I called Fiona. And then I called the Ontario Provincial Police Financial Crimes Unit, where I had, over the previous 2 months of building this file, quietly established contact with a detective I'll call Detective Marsh because she asked me to keep her name out of it. She was methodical and unhurried and had the kind of patience that comes from years of watching people think they're smarter than they are. I delivered the file in person, printed, tabbed, organized. Cover letter written by Fiona, 51 pages. Detective Marsh went through it slowly, asking a question here and there. When she reached the last page, she looked up and said, Mr. Kowalski, this is the cleanest file I've received in 2 years. When do you think he'll move? I said. He's got a closing date in 40 days, and he knows the deal needs a clean title. He'll want to come to me before that. I'd give him 10 days, maybe 2 weeks. She said, we'll be positioned. I said, so will I. It was 9 days, a Tuesday in late September, the kind of cool, bright Ontario morning that makes you feel like the year is finally being honest with itself. I was sitting on my back porch with a coffee, looking at the garden Elaine and I had put in together over about 15 years of Saturdays. The Japanese maple she'd planted the year we paid off the mortgage. The cedar hedge we'd argued about the entire summer we put it in and then both loved completely once it grew in. The raised beds I'd built her the year she said she finally wanted to try growing her own tomatoes. I heard a car turn into the driveway, then a second car a few seconds later. I didn't move. I set my coffee down slowly on the arm of the chair. I already knew. The knock came 3 times, sharp and deliberate. I walked through my house, through the kitchen, where Elaine had made Sunday breakfast for 20 years, past the hallway where Meg's school photos were still on the wall, because I hadn't had the heart to take them down, to the front door. I opened it. Trevor stood on my porch in a blazer, freshly shaved, wearing the cologne I'd come to associate with every time he wanted to make an impression. Behind him was a man in a suit carrying a document case, and beside him, standing slightly back from the door, with her arms wrapped around herself like she was cold, was my daughter. Meg wasn't looking at me, she was looking at the porch boards. Her jaw was tight. I'd seen that expression on her face twice in her life. Once at her mother's funeral, and once when she was 16 and had something difficult to tell me and didn't know how to start. I made a decision in that second. I decided it was the second kind, that she was scared and she loved me, and she hadn't understood, until recently, what she'd been standing next to. I told myself that. I kept telling myself that. Trevor smiled at me with the ease of a man who believes the other person in the conversation has no idea what's coming. He said, "Alan, hope we're not catching you at a bad time." I said, "Not at all. Come in." We stood in my living room. The man with the document case set it on the coffee table. Elaine and I had bought at an antique market in St. Jacobs. Trevor stood with his hands in his pockets, weight back on his heels, entirely comfortable. He cleared his throat. He said, "So, I want to have an honest conversation with you about the house. About what happens next." I said, "What happens next?" He said, "Meg and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about what makes sense financially and practically. And we've actually moved forward on some of those plans. The property has been transferred into joint names. You know, as a natural next step, a kind of early inheritance arrangement. I mentioned it to Meg and she thought it made sense. And we've gone ahead and accepted an offer. Strong offer, Alan, well above asking. The closing is in 40 days, give or take. The plan would be for you to transition from here by then. We've already looked at some options for you. There's a retirement residence in Waterloo that would really suit you, I think. Very well maintained, all-inclusive, easy lifestyle." He said it like he was announcing a holiday he'd booked on my behalf. I looked at him for a long moment. He looked back at me with complete confidence. The notary man was looking at his document case, and Meg was looking at me now, finally, and her face had gone the particular pale that skin goes when something has just finished making sense in a terrible way. I said, "Trevor, that's interesting, because I sent a package to the OPP Financial Crimes Unit about 6 weeks ago. A detective I've been working with for a couple of months. She's been very patient, very thorough. They tend to be, with the good ones." His expression didn't change immediately. It changed the way a structural problem in a building reveals itself. First there's nothing, then there's a hairline, crack, then everything you thought was solid turns out to be load-bearing on a lie. He said, "What are you talking about?" I said, "The forged transfer of title. The notary whose Law Society commission was suspended 8 months ago. The numbered company in Ontario you incorporated 11 months before you met my daughter. The same scheme you ran in Brantford 2 years ago on a 74-year-old man. The cash payment to the notary that's documented in a sworn statement from a separate proceeding. 51 pages, tabbed and indexed, cover letter from my solicitor." He said nothing. I said, "So here's what I'd like to do. Before we go any further with this document visit, I think we should go to the police station first. They're actually very interested in what I sent them about you. And I texted Detective Marsh about 12 minutes ago when I heard you pull in." From the doorway of the hall came the sound of someone stepping up onto the porch. Trevor looked at the front door. I said I wouldn't. He didn't. Detective Marsh came in through the front door I'd left on the latch. She stepped into my living room and looked at Trevor Ashworth with the flat, professional patience of someone who has been waiting for exactly this moment and has the paperwork to make it permanent. She said, "Mr. Ashworth, I'm Detective Marsh, OPP Financial Crimes. Mr. Kowalski, I'll take it from here if that's all right." I said, "Please," she said. "Mr. Ashworth, I'm going to need you to come with me. You have the right to retain and instruct counsel without delay." Trevor said, "This is completely insane." She said, "You have the right to a reasonable opportunity to exercise that right. Do you understand?" He said, "Meg, tell them this is a misunderstanding. Tell them." Meg turned away from him. It was quiet and final, and she walked to the window and stood looking out at the Japanese maple in the front yard, and she did not say a single word. Detective Marsh continued the caution. She had him in handcuffs in my living room. On the hardwood floor, Elaine and I had finished summer. Meg finished university. He was talking as he was walked out. Explanations escalating into accusations, escalating into something that stopped making grammatical sense, and then the front door closed, and he was gone. The man with the document case had not moved. He looked at me and said, "I want you to know I was told this was a standard family estate transfer. I had no knowledge it was disputed." I said, "Then you'll want to speak to Detective Marsh before you leave. She'll have questions." He nodded and walked out, and then it was just me and Meg. She stood at the window for a long time. I stood in the middle of my living room and waited, the way I'd learned from Elaine and from 30 years of being someone's parent, that you sometimes have to let a person arrive at the thing they need to say instead of going to get them. Finally, she said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I suspected from the first night I met him. I had evidence the day after your wedding." She turned around. Her face was doing several things at once, the way faces do when a person is trying to hold more than one feeling at the same time and not quite managing. She said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you were happy, and because suspicion isn't the same as proof, and because I needed him to show everything before I moved." She said, "The house, it's still yours." I said, "It was never his. I put it in an irrevocable trust 14 months ago, the week after you got engaged. The transfer he filed was void the second he submitted it. The purchase agreement with his buyer company is void. The whole transaction has no legal existence." She stared at me. I said, "Fiona did good work." She said, "Who's Fiona?" I said, "My solicitor." Meg sat down on the couch. She pressed her hands over her face. I sat beside her and put my arm around her and didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that wouldn't get in the way. After a while she said, "He told me you'd already agreed. He said you'd mentioned to him that you wanted to put the house in both our names as an early inheritance before you got too much older. He said you'd brought it up." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have called you to ask." I said, "He's very good at what he does." She was quiet again. Then she said, "I keep thinking about Mum." I said, "Yeah, me too." She said, "Do you think she would have seen it?" I thought about that for a moment. About Elaine in the church basement 34 years ago, about the way she could read a room, about what she'd said in the hospital. I said, "I think she saw something like it the day you were born. That's why she asked me to watch." Meg made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. We sat there for a long time in the living room of the house that nobody had taken from us. Trevor Ashworth was charged with fraud over $5,000, forgery, and uttering a forged document under the Criminal Code of Canada. Felony-level offenses, all three. The Brantford case was reopened. The OPP Financial Crimes Unit subsequently identified 2 additional fraudulent title transfer attempts connected to Trevor's Ontario numbered company, both targeting property owners over the age of 70, both using the same suspended notary and the same shell company structure. The Law Society of Ontario moved against the notary directly. He cooperated with investigators. Trevor's Audi was repossessed. His numbered companies were dissolved by order of the court. The Audi, it turned out, had been leased through one of them. The trial took 3 days. His defense argued that the transfer had been completed under a reasonable belief, that consent had been given, that the family arrangement had been communicated verbally, and the documentation was simply an administrative formalization of an agreement already in place. The jury took 4 hours. They came back with guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to 6 years in a federal correctional institution. He was 35 on the day of sentencing. Meg filed for annulment 8 weeks after the arrest. The grounds were fraudulent misrepresentation, that the marriage had been entered into on the basis of material falsehoods about his character, intentions, and business conduct. Fiona handled it. The annulment was granted in under 4 months, which Fiona said was unusually fast, but not surprising given the criminal conviction. My daughter moved back in with me for a while. She slept in her old room. We had dinner together most nights. I taught her how to make the lamb stew. Elaine used it to make in October, the one Meg had always said was too complicated to bother with. It turned out to be mostly patience and decent stock. Most things that seem complicated are, once you're actually paying attention. She got a new apartment in Waterloo in the spring. On moving day, she stood in my front hall with her last box and looked at me and said, "Dad, thank you for all of it, for not telling me." For letting me figure it out, I said. Your mother would have done the same. She smiled. That full face, full body smile that's been Elaine's smile since she was 3 days old. Then she said, no. Mom would have confronted him at the engagement dinner and made the whole restaurant witness to it. I laughed. Genuinely, in a way I hadn't in a long time. I said, you're absolutely right. She carried her box out to the car. I stood on the porch and watched her go, and then I went back inside. Barry came over for dinner a few weeks later. We ate on the back porch, and he opened a bottle of something he'd been saving since I don't remember when, and he looked around at the garden and said, Alan, you built that whole thing from the ground up, 14 months before it mattered. You planned it all. I said, I just paid attention. That's all. He said, most people don't pay that kind of attention. I thought about a February morning 4 years ago. About toast getting cold. About 9 minutes not being enough. I said, I made a promise to someone. Barry nodded. He already knew who. We finished the bottle. The Japanese maple was just beginning to turn. That deep red orange it goes in late September. And the garden was doing the quiet thing it does at the end of a season. Settling into itself. I watched it for a while. Then I went inside and washed up and put the leftovers away and turned off the kitchen light. Some people see a 61-year-old widower in a paid-off house in Kitchener and think they see an easy target. The problem with that thinking is that it says everything about what they understand and nothing about what they don't. Trevor Ashworth learned that distinction the hard way. It was the only lesson he ever got from me. But I made sure it was the one that stuck.